Welcome back, everyone. So, we get a little bit of a break this week, if you will. Not from work, it'll be pretty much the exact same kind of work as before, but in tone. Last week, as we saw, we had basically massacre after massacre after massacre, whether it was the Peasants' Crusade in the Rhineland attacking the local Jewish populations or the main intended contingent of the crusade treating quite similarly when you get right down to it various civilian populations in the Holy Land. Doesn't seem to matter, lots of massacres. So it's really quite surprising that this week is not going to be about reprisal massacres. I mean, on the one hand, it's hardly as though the wanton killing of as many as 70,000 civilians, largely civilians in Jerusalem, that hardly went unnoticed in the Islamic world. You do have certain outcries of, despair, of shock at this level of cruelty and violence, but there's no organized, dedicated response. There's no serious attempt at something like a counter jihad, because remember, we have the concept of jihad already in Islam, and it seems like the natural response to a crusade, right? But there's no attempt to do that for an entire century after the First Crusade, or, well, I suppose more like half a century when you get right down to it. But for about a half century, there's no serious attempt to launch a counter jihad. And when there is one, as you'll see next unit, it's met with considerable suspicion and dissent in the Islamic community. Most people think that it's a cynical kind of power grab on the part of the initiator of that. But more on that next week. So why? Why isn't there violence met out in response to the sort of violence that the Crusaders inflicted upon the populations in Palestine? There's a couple of possible explanations here. One would be misconception, right? It seems in most of the Islamic sources from the period that the Crusaders are seen to be, well, basically what Alexios had asked for originally, that they were Frankish mercenaries fighting on behalf of Byzantium for secular objectives. The loss of Jerusalem, obviously grievous to the Islamic community, because as you saw in Unit 3's readings, it's holy to that religion as much as it is to Judaism or Christianity. But this was seen to be kind of an ambitious, organized campaign by Byzantium with the help of Frankish mercenaries, not anything like an existential threat against Islam or even a religious attack on Islam. From your readings in the Quran, you can see the sort of tone that's encouraged against oppression of Islam. So that's one possible answer, but I don't think it's really sufficient, right? Because not everyone would have remained in that misconception for very long. Perhaps a more important factor, or at least one that's equally important, is the fragmentation of the Islamic world in that particular area at the time. You have Seljuk Turks as something like the dominant group, but the Seljuk Turks are really not united amongst each other. They've divided up into many different petty principalities, if you will. You have the still larger threat, in the eyes of most Turks, I think, of the Fatimid Caliphate, a rival Shiite caliphate, which is far more threatening and far more offensive, probably, to the Sunni Turks than these Frankish Crusaders would be. And in a way, that's pretty familiar from what you've seen in the Christian context. So you've got that, you've got Turks, you've got Fatimids. There's also cities like Damascus, which is going to feature quite heavily in the next unit, that are not under Turkish control, but under local Arab control, and don't necessarily align with the Turks on all things. That actually, Damascus, among others, will become allies of the new Kingdom of Jerusalem under Christian control. And then you've got a substantial Kurdish minority that is also going to start playing a role here. As you can imagine, this would be difficult then to create something like an organized response across all of these divisions, a sustained attack on these new Christian states that have appeared, with doing all of that without exposing oneself to enemies more local might be quite the deterrent. Still, surely the Crusaders realized that they were in a precarious position. Most of the crusaders, after completing the crusade, went home. After all, they were pilgrims. Pilgrims don't stay, typically, to the place they visit. They received their crusading indulgence, they prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, and they went home. Only a few stayed to inherit and control the lands that they had gained in this conquest. And that minority was not a huge military threat. Maybe that's another factor to the lack of a counter jihad, just that this wasn't a huge threat to the local powers that be. For that group, clearly, accommodation was key, right? Without the military force, even though they established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states in such a bloody way, peaceful accommodation would have been critical to their continued survival. If they antagonized the conquered majority too much, that majority could rise up and they would not have the ability to repress that. So taxes are softened, laws are respected, and there's very little attempt to oppress the countryside in particular, which is staffed by the local Muslims who had been there before. In fact, you get a kind of cultural synthesis that emerges. The descendants of the Crusaders will rapidly embrace many aspects of Arabic lifestyle. Peaceful accommodation, then, that's one solution, but maybe not enough to ensure security. For minor short-term things, you'll see you get smaller crusades organized to supply or relieve pressure from the Crusader states, but that can't be a sustainable solution either. For the long-term sustainable solution, or at least a contributing factor, we have to turn to, of all things, monasticism and monastic reform. Back in Europe, this period saw a contemporaneous rise in all kinds of new monasticisms that tended to be more aesthetic, growing out of this sort of distrust, suspicion about wealth, and the fact that traditional monasteries were obscenely wealthy. So you've got a character like Bernard of Clairvaux, who will be very important for the Second Crusade, a Cistercian reformer who makes the Cistercians popular on the idea that they'll be doing their own manual labor rather than relying on slave gangs to do everything for them, even though the Cistercians will sell out very fast. But this impulse is back in Europe, and lots of new monastic orders are cropping up everywhere. Maybe that's the best explanation for why people turn to monasticism to solve this, by creating military orders. Bernard of Clairvaux, by the way, will also be one of the people responsible for making the Knights Templar so popular and well-funded back in Europe, because he praises this. So what's a military order like the Knights Templar? Basically, it's a combination of the knightly profession and the monastic profession, to be a monk knight, a monk soldier, if you will, which might seem like an interesting contradiction. Certainly nothing in the forms of monasticism you saw in Unit 1 and 2 would possibly have mapped onto what these orders become. They'll live in common, they won't hold personal property, they'll sing the liturgy, they'll do all of that, but then they also leave and go fight. And staff the castles, for that matter. So this is novel, but in some ways it's the logical conclusion of the crusading ideal, right? Holy violence, monk, knight, as one. It makes sense to a certain degree. That's one outcome, among several we've already mentioned, of these new Crusader states. Another, of course, is increased contact between the Latin Christian world and the Islamic world. And this has to be one among a couple different avenues. There's also Sicily, which had recently come back under Christian control by the Norman conquest after it had been under Islamic control for a couple centuries there. And Spain, the ongoing Reconquista that we'll go and visit in Unit 11. Spain is obviously an important place for Christian-Muslim contact as well. An outcome of this contact, intriguingly, is an intellectual revival in the Latin West, what we scholars often call the 12th century Renaissance. As you recall, the Islamic world had far superior scholarship in basically every category and had done a much better job in general of preserving Greco-Roman learning in all its forms, in particular with an attraction to Aristotle, whereas in the Latin West and Greek East, these Christian worlds, more of an intellectual appeal came from Plato. Turns out that kind of matters in a deeper sort of way. Well, In the 12th century Renaissance, basically every field of learning is reborn, hence Renaissance, which means rebirth. Theology, law, science, and engineering, medicine, across all of these fields, major gains appear in the Latin literature, some of them simply translations of Arabic texts, but in other cases, interpreting the gains that the Arabic scholars had made, that the Islamic scholars had made of various groups, and building upon those in significant ways. Aristotle is reintroduced with so many important ramifications of that, I can't even get started. But suffice it to say, it's important. And original Islamic scholars like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina had major impacts of their own. One that I'll end with here is the eventual emergence of universities, sort of an outcome of the 12th century Renaissance, with professors and students and degrees and all of the basic features to explain why you're here now doing this. So I guess the Crusades are kind of relevant to your life. Kind of. All right. Engage in these readings. Enjoy the break from constant massacres. We will go back there a little bit in the next unit when we do the Second Crusade. But for now, we have a new interesting historical context to analyze. Have fun.